Before we get started in this episode, a quick announcement. As you know, I'm very passionate about acceptance and commitment therapy, and I also run a busy practice in Canberra. We're currently looking for psychologists who are registered in Australia to join our team, who are also passionate about learning about ACT. We provide supervision on a group and individual basis and training around ACT. So if this is you, if you're interested, please express your interest at strategicpsychology.com.au/careers. Look forward to hearing from you. And now back to this episode.
Okay, life can be crazy. You're feeling like you're sinking, just trying to find a meaning. It's time for better thinking, yeah, better thinking. Time to tune in. Let's go.
Welcome back to Better Thinking. My name's Nesh Nikolic, and today's guest is Dr. Roy Sugarman, here to talk to us about psychology and the role of biology. Roy's biography is extremely extensive. He's got a wealth of experience working with young persons, adults in coaching atmospheres, corporate atmospheres, and obviously in a clinical atmosphere. He practices in Sydney in 2 different practices. Best place to look at his bio is to go to roysugarman.com. Otherwise, I'll bore you for the next 15 minutes going through all of his achievements and accolades and the like, but highly experienced clinician here to talk to us about what I think is incredibly fascinating, looking at how these 2 worlds come together, not only psychology, but our biology. And I think Roy has got a really interesting perspective about those 2 worlds coming together. So please welcome Dr. Roy Sugarman. Roy, a big thank you for coming onto the show.
Thank you for getting me here. That's great. Such fun.
Look, I'm really excited to talk about, psychology and biology and the 2 worlds coming together. I know it's something that you're very passionate about, and you've got great experience across working with children, young persons, all the way to performance athletes. Where should we start?
Well, where I started was I decided years ago when I was running restaurants and doing all kinds of things, and I went to university a few years in a row and landed up just doing a degree, and then realized when I'd signed on that it was a degree in biological psychology, and it was a 3-year undergraduate, which I did part-time while running restaurants. So 2 a.m. till 6 a.m, sitting, writing some kind of project and, falling asleep and then wrote 13 exams in 10 days to finish off the degree. And I remember falling asleep in the bath and wondering if I could learn to breathe underwater, which was going to be my life since then, was breathing underwater. But the first thing somebody said to me after I finished my degree, "What did you learn?" And I said, the first thing I learned is you cannot use a rational argument to undo an idea that somebody got irrationally. And it was really weird because, when I started my honors degree and then master's degree and doctoral degrees, they would always ask, you must be interested in people and how do you make sense of people? And I say, well, the first thing I learned is that you cannot make sense of human behavior, because as Sapolsky says, in the split second, in the minutes, in the hours, in the days, in the millennia, in the 200,000 years before a behavior, you cannot make sense of it unless you understand emotion. And how do you understand emotion when emotional arguments are not subject to rationality? And everybody was doing fine, and then along comes Trump and they get it. You cannot use a rational explanation to undo an idea that was created irrationally, emotionally. So that fascinated me. And so I see the brain as just a battleground between psychology and biology. And the astonishing thing is that people don't get it.
Can you explain that a little bit in terms of how that came about, where you became aware of that? What was that sort of point where that dropped for you in terms of that? There's an irrationality that's kind of built in our emotions versus in our logic.
Sure. And, years before, Dan Ariely spoke of the, the rational irrationality of human beings from an economic point of view. And long before a lot of this stuff came out, I started to see the works of Bill Miller and Steve Rolnick coming out, where they were saying what happens in psychology is really, how do you create a warm relationship in which the person can make their own arguments? What are the emotional drivers behind human motivation? And more importantly, you cannot change someone with a web of inspiring speech and concepts of resistance from Paul Dell and others, and began to realize, whoa, the study of psychology is the study of irrationality, of emotion, and it's got nothing to do with the intellect. You can do an IQ test, which predicts how you're going to do in a Western educational system. Or that's all very fine, and you can do all these projective tests of Rorschach and draw a person. And I was just looking at this going, I don't get it. So when Steve Rolnick and Bill Miller came out with, in 1987, their first real exposition of the book on motivational interviewing, and later on Dan Pink and others would jump on the bandwagon, it occurred to me that motivating people was creating a warm relationship in which they could encounter their own resolve to change. We were not going to get anywhere with psychology unless we understood the biology of irrationality. And that meant to me there was a struggle going on in the brain, and I wanted to know who was going to win. And then as I got more into the neuroscience of the mesial temporal lobes and how the lateral temporal lobes work and how the two of them struggle to reconcile in the role of the frontal lobes, doing the difficult thing that's the right thing to do in Sapolsky terms, then I began to be more use in studying traumatic brain injury, in studying psychosis, in studying mood and anxiety disorders. And it made sense to me that diagnosis in terms of a label was useless. How do we describe human behavior in terms of the seconds, minutes, hours, 100,000 years before? The research that started to come out was scary, to think that we have this rational view that we know what's going on. We have no clue. The arguments about free will and the argument, oh, rubbish. 95% is the subconscious mess, and the rest is janitorial and cleaning it up. And when I began to work with Brain Resource and other companies, I began to realize that what we do is we spend our lives with these post hoc rationalizations of how we feel, what we feel, and how we make sense of why we hate or love. Absolute rubbish. Which is quite frightening when you're basically a scientist and then you discover what you're studying is rubbish. If you can understand rubbish, my old professor used to say, if you can understand nonsense, you can understand reality. So it was such fun.
So how would you describe the free will?
What free will?
Yeah.
I think that when you really think about free will, when you think about God, when you think about religion, when you think about Martin Luther being an obsessive compulsive schizotypal personality, heaven forbid, and that what he was doing was really, he wrote, the more I wash my hands, the dirtier they get. I go, ooh, you should have had some meds there, Martin. But then we wouldn't have Protestantism. What did I make of it? How did I make stuff out of it? I got depressed when I realized there was no free will. And that was scary when I realized in the shape of 1 minute, there was no evolution in terms of creationism. When you could demonstrate that with simply showing some hand movements and why somebody tinkered with it and didn't make it from scratch. You then run into all the irrationality of human beings because you realize there is no free will. This is a mopping up, janitorial exercise in cleaning up the mess you just made without knowing why you made it. And that was the human condition. Very depressing. Very depressing.
So one would argue on the other side, and that's obviously part of my role in this podcast to push topics around, one would argue to say, look, I do have free will. I choose how I, respond with my children or what I do with my children, what I'm going to do on the weekend. I do some planning. What am I not seeing in that picture?
What you're not seeing is the science of putting people in scans, of doing experiments and realizing that you think you're making choices. You think you're making rational choices. And let's just look at a few studies that kind of blow holes in that. Study of 1,000 Israeli judges. And we got, when I speak we, I mean scientists who actually do experiments, not those who read about it, intellectual gunnifs like me. But we studied 1,000 Israeli judges' decisions on parole. And the judges wrote about their parole decisions in each case, why they chose to give parole or not. And then they ran it through all kinds of, nice reductionistic experiments and discovered the single feature of the judge's decision was how recently they'd had a meal. Good Jewish judges can't live for more than 2 hours without food. If you went straight after lunch for parole, 60, 70% chance of getting it. 2 hours later, 0 chance. These judges were rationalizing the decisions. Choosing whether someone's guilty or innocent is a rational decision. Choosing whether to punish them or not, completely irrational. If I'm getting a job interview done and the person interviewing me is sitting on a hard chair, the chances are they're not going to be too happy with me and probably see me as hard, uncompromising, difficult. It's kind of uncomfortable around this guy. And if they're in a nice, comfortable chair, I've got a much better chance of being seen as accommodating, warm, and whatever. And God help me if they're holding a cold latte in their hands while they're doing it instead of a warm cappuccino. My chances of getting high just fell through the floor, because apparently when there's a cold drink in your hand, I'm cold and distant and nasty. And what about bad smells in the room? What about giving people discussions of coronavirus and then asking them their social cognitive views on immigration? We are subject to a lot of mopping up. It's not free will. Yes, of course, you can impose a lot of decision making and problem solving, but you're not going to be terribly confident if you know what you're doing. You're not going to be confident that you did it rationally, because a lot of your decision making was done for you by a 70 million year old piece of equipment called the insula or the anterior cingulate or the limbic cortex, the septum, the hippocampus talking to each other. And you know what? They're all at war with your pretty new shining frontal lobes, which don't really have strength to them. They're just too new at this game. Whereas the limbic cortex, these guys are old and they know what they do. There is this war for control of your outcomes where you will be just mopping up. And when you get that, when you look at how brains evolved and when you look at how human brains evolved, and when you compare what we do differently to animals and what we are the same as in animals, like, why do we like females more at a certain time of day or month? If they're ovulating, their voices are higher pitched, which is nice. Their faces are more symmetrical because they're retaining water. It may not blow up their baboon bums to look all red and fluffy, but they're retaining water to look more symmetrical, and they become more attractive to us and us to them, and more sensitive to skin stroking. We're not terribly rational at that level. And then when you think about the higher functions drawing on all of those without us noticing it, if you've got free will, don't trust yourself, because it's not that free. There's no free lunch in the brain. There are interesting, incredible things. We're very arrogant in thinking that we're not animals. We're very arrogant in thinking we're Homo sapiens. We are Homo, God knows what, Homo secretus. We've got a lot of secrets going on and we don't know what's going on. So this is what's intrigued me about how psychological approaches and how the strategies would play directly into what responses in the brain. And that then took me the next sort of 20 years from 87 to 2007 to start to feel comfortable about which psychological interventions targeted the brain as a neurological entity. And then getting fascinated with the hundreds of books I've reviewed since then and published reviews on them about what the brain means to therapy, and the peril that comes in when you as a psychologist think you're making a web of inspiring speech when all it counts is how much did the person like you.
So in some sense, there's the complexity of rationality is us putting a narrative to the choices that we've made.
Oh,
When,
absolutely.
in actual fact, what you're arguing is there are sort of intrinsic cues,
Under the hood.
feelings,
Under the hood, secretive stuff going on.
things that
Yes.
kind of, place impressions on us to do things or to behave in certain ways. And then we put a narrative to that to say the reason why I did X was because of Y.
Yeah.
But when you put that under the microscope, like in the judge's experiment or study, that might be more attributable to whether someone's well-fed or not, or blood sugars or whatever it might be.
Sure, the hormones, what their cortisol levels are looking like, follicular stimulating hormone, what is happening with the adrenaline pumping off their adrenal glands, is it dragging testosterone with it, the effects of testosterone, so misunderstood and such rubbish in a lot of the early literature about giving testosterone to fetuses made the females more aggressive, all this rubbish. There's a lot of bad science, and neuroscience has criticized itself. There's a lot of bad science, so it's difficult. But yes, essentially, we invent these narratives to explain behavior that happened in the last whatever, and we have wonderful, lyrical, beautiful, eloquent, philosophical explanations for why groups of people do stuff. But very often, how long a mother suckles her baby for, how loud she talks to it, depends on what her ancestors did for a living 400 years before, and what your risks of diabetes are, depending on when your grandmother's fetus was being nurtured in the Dutch hunger winter, or all the epigenetic stuff, or whether you're a white policeman who is much more prone to pull a trigger on a guy with a mobile phone instead of a gun because the mobile phone's in the hands of a black guy, then you realize the explanations, the post hoc narratives, are not a reasonably accurate, but useful, but not a reasonably accurate sign that we have a sentient human being totally in control of their lives or their motivations or their thoughts. The evidence is completely the other way. Absolutely not. Free will? Absolutely not. You would think that 74 million people voting for Donald doing so out of free will, most of them have got more cleaning products in their homes than the liberals, because they're much more sensitive to disgust, and the insula is more active in conservative people, as it was with Martin Luther, who washed his hands and they got dirtier because the insula was producing disgust and he didn't get that. And then, of course, we hijack that to decide, Puerto Ricans or Mexicans or somebody's disgusting and we should not let them across the border because they're rapists and murderers. And people like Donald Trump or Adolf Hitler or others, not very bright, but very intuitive, know how to play people's emotions. And then you see these patterns that we get in society of people doing the easy thing that's the wrong thing to do, instead of doing the hard thing that's the right thing to do. And we don't know what stories we make up. We don't know if we're telling ourselves the truth, and the chances are we're not.
How does this play into how a psychologist might do their work and working with their clients' narratives, or working with their own narratives, working with the narrative of, this therapy is a useful therapy, or even if I take this one step further, I know there's a lot in this one question. How do we do even public policy when we're trying to use the rational brain?
Well, Australians have a wonderful phrase called herding cats. You're trying to herd cats like you would herd sheep, and they're all over the place and sticking to you and scratching, and that's politics. So the answer is obviously for politicians and social stuff, and for psychologists to understand how emotions work, and not just the emotions of fear and fight and flight and freeze. And, we've got colleagues writing very erudite books mentioning fear, fight, flight, freeze, all this kind of stuff, rest and digest. But really understanding the individual differences. And Psychology really is about creating a warm relationship with someone where basically they can sort out their own stuff, not being, thinking I know and I have this philosophy and understanding of the human brain or mind. It's very humbling to go, every human being is so unique depending on the neighborhood that their anterior pituitary is pumping hormones out of, because the bloody thing doesn't have set areas. The whole thing does everything. And so if you're pumping it out here or here, you're getting a different human being at the time. Is really just creating a warm relationship and then looking, as we've got better and better with science, where do we go? Let's look at newer therapies, third order CBT, second order CBT, acceptance and commitment therapy. It hooks into motivational interviewing in what motivates a human being. Number one, autonomy, guiding my own life. Well, guiding your own life around what? Well, the who and what is important to me. Oh, your values. So now we have in acceptance and commitment the need to guide our own lives using our values as some kind of lodestar, and then working through with clients. Because when you ask people what their values are, they go, family, money, friends. They don't get into depth. When you're born into a religion, you may be issued with 613 values in Judaism. The Quran as a wonderful guideline to life and everyday living and so on. These are value systems. Just hand it over to you, follow this, and you're all okay. So now we think, okay, guiding your own life is a good principle. Autonomy. Around what? Around your values, around the things that are important to you. Well, that turns out to be very useful because we're goal setting and the goals are based on values. And then growth, mastery, getting better and better at something that is important to me so I can guide my own life. So human growth, by getting the values right and making decisions based on that. Being mindful of what? Life sucks. Life is full of disasters. We're hardwired for negativity neurologically. The amygdala isn't sitting there looking for the bright sunny sky at the end of the rainbow. It's looking for the hawk that's going to come and peck your eyes out. It's looking at the collapse of the ecosystem. It's preparing you for the next ice age. Positivity is synthetic, as Dan Gilbert has shown. So helping people set micro goals, because the human cortex doesn't think ahead more than 3 months. If anybody says to me, what's your 5-year plan? I'm going to show them what 4-letter words in several languages sound like. What a stupid idea, when the average good human brain in his 30s can think forward about 12 weeks. What about your 3-month goals? What about setting goals according to your values? All of this becomes very useful, but what about the sense of relatedness? The human executive functions, the frontal lobes evolved as social instruments. They evolved for gossip, for dealing with other people. So autonomy, guiding your own life around your values, the things that are important to you, and in the process, getting better and better at that. But we know the value of socializing, of having a sense of relatedness, where the people around you share that. So you find your own people, and now everybody has a sense of purpose. Everybody gather hands and sing, "We shall overcome." You have a happy person. So I think where there are now 300 studies on relational frame science, that we are not Skinnerian pigeons and we are not Pavlov's dogs. And now we go into relational frames of how human beings learn both wonderful things and also terror at the things that could go wrong. We all know what a vroom vroom car is, as Tim Gordon points out. We all know what daddy's car and my little car, the same thing. I know that this is not a motorbike, and I know a motorbike's not half a car. I also know what a car crash looks like. If I was never in one, I would still be scared of one. All of this is neurological. All of this makes sense if you understand the anterior cingulate, the insula, the mesial cortex of the temporal lobes, how we integrate at the tertiary level, what the CA1 and subiculum do in post-traumatic stress, and how the hippocampus shrinks and the amygdala grows under trauma, and it doesn't get better in PTSD. Yes, when you take the narratives that psychology has developed around science and around the neurology of how we learn and the neurology of the weak, slow executive functions versus you start to become, I think, a better therapist, because it screams biology and it doesn't come up with the schizophrenogenic mother, or that gay is something to do with your mother putting you in pink or some other rubbish. So I think we can mop up those narratives in psychology using process-based CBT. What does behavioral activation do? And then reversing it into behavior therapies and older CBTs, and not making Martin Seligman's mess up with the American Army, trying to make them all positive. The last time I saw a positive drill sergeant, he was dead. One should not get positive in the battlefield, you know. So I know that's kind of a long-winded bringing together of everything, but I think we are getting better as psychologists because we're getting better tools, because somebody understands how we learn and how we get afraid and how irrational we are, and they start to put together decent therapies.
Is that why there's maybe a little bit of a leaning, at least here in Australia, toward your sort of process-based, whether it's like ACT or whether it's emotion-focused therapy, you know, sort of trying to work with, you know, these even schema in many ways, talking about modes that were, you know, developed, you know, as young people. Do you think that's maybe why there's a bit of a leaning in that we naturally are finding them a bit more effective? Certainly not suggesting that, you know, CBT isn't still extremely valuable, but I suppose there's lots of different ways that psychologists themselves actually practice each one of those approaches.
Sure, and I think obviously ACT takes, you know, elements, mindfulness and other things out of CBT, but doesn't sit there fusing to thoughts and, you know, challenging them and doing stuff. Because most of the kids I work with, for instance, are severely autistic. Some of them with really difficult cases, you know, with the police fear to tread and so on. So yes, I think we do go in the right direction, but my American colleagues are quite cynical, and they say that psychology advances one funeral at a time, waiting for academics and professors to die off. You know, they've been studying the same thing their whole lives and got experted and wrote books on it and everything else. And I see that sometimes when you go into a board of people, you know, building up a new charity or something else, and we have people who are experts in their field, and one has to wait for them to die for the next expert to be able to shove their way into academia. So I think what the wonderful guys like Hayes and Hoffman and all of these people with process-based and ACT and advancing all that time with hundreds of studies, starting off with a really good theory, you know, relational frames and the contextual stuff, which, you know, I've been looking at context for years rather than intrapsychic phenomenon, looking at how neurology engages with context, because genes don't define behavior. The context tells the genes what they need to do and don't do it under those circumstances. So yes, I have not a problem with CBT or psychodynamic therapies or anything you want to do, but to keep it kosher, halal, and all very nice, you better link it to the neurology of what's going on. Otherwise, I think we're cheating people. And one sees that in a patient I know who was in therapy for multiple years, who went to a neuropsychiatrist who said, I'm going to test you for stuff, and discovered he had two problems. Number one, thyroid, which was 30% of his depression. And number two, he was infected with toxoplasmosis gondii, which was making him reckless because his mom had kept kittens, and he had picked it up as a fetus. He had picked up, you know, toxoplasmosis. So, yeah, I think at our peril, we need to really defend psychology as a science, and neuropsychology in particular, and any other forms, sports psychology, peak performance psychology, but make sure we are biologists and we're not thinking of the ghost in the machine and only interacting with that. I think it's a dreadful error, and patients don't like it.
In the spirit of hoping that some of this sticks, and obviously we can integrate these things that you've said, I often find that interesting research does create an emotive response in many of us because it's exciting and it's cutting edge and the like.
yeah.
What are some of the standout studies, the researchers that you have looked at, read about, that you and your colleagues have I suppose, leaned on in terms of understanding the biology, kind of like the judge's study, which I've read about as well, which is mind blowing. But what are some of the keystone studies that you think demonstrate the importance of appreciating one's biology in therapy?
Sure. Look, I know there are tons of books of being a brain-wise therapist and whatever else. And John Ratey, I think, for me, started to produce, he wrote his book Spark with Eric Hageman, co-wrote it with him. But I think when a psychiatrist like John Ratey, involved with personality disorders and other stuff, just began to integrate. And I think where I get excited is in the integrationists. When they start saying, let's not get caught up in a bucket. Let's not get caught up in, we understand everything from a behavioral point of view. We understand everything from a neurobiological, neuroendocrinological, biological, evolutionary. I like all the integrationists. So John Ratey, for me, was the first psychiatrist who really came out of the woodwork and said, wow, when we do physical things with a patient or with a student, or if we want to enhance human performance or start to treat stuff, we now look and go, wow, this is really good if we integrate movement, nutrition. So years ago, I joined a group which was quite small but looking impressive called Athletes Performance, which is now known as Team EXOS, X's and O's. And they had 4 pillars which were revolutionizing the way athletes were being trained by their trainers, which was movement, nutrition, mindset, and recovery. And they asked me to join them all the way across from Arizona to Sydney, Australia, as the Director of Applied Neuroscience in Performance Innovation. And the first things we began to look at was they did the movement stuff really well, complex movement. They did the nutrition really well, with great nutritionists, getting people to eat, low human interference food and producing their own restaurant there, which produced the most fantastic food. And recovery, which was, you could, looking at the science of how the muscles under stress produce brain-derived neurotrophic factor and endothelial growth factors and human growth factors, and how this recovery did stuff. And then, of course, we began to see that those growth factors were going to be used by the brain, and the mindset piece wasn't that good. Over the next 10 years, I spent my time convincing them to the point that we're now a mindset, movement, nutrition, and recovery company. Mindset has become the single most important part of athlete-centered coaching. And I've also introduced for them values-based coaching. How does the coach align the values of the player with the values of the organization, the values of the team? Not, I'm the coach, I'm a genius. I know there's no science of coaching, really, although Nick Winkelman and a few of my other colleagues from there who've branched out have done incredible well, Brett as well. What do we do now? The integration then began, what about human beings? And there comes John Ratey, showing that half an hour of movement introduced to an American school system would raise the IQ by 15, 20%, would raise the math scores and the SAT scores and all of this. So what was it about movement? What was it about nutrition? And so then integrated neuroscience, really, and integrated dietetics. And as we know, nutritionists have struggled with very little data for years because you can't do decent controlled studies easily. Tim Noakes coming into the fray and upsetting everybody with, central governor theories and nutrition stuff, and working his way into ketone diets and all of these things. So I think for me, the integration, the research into integrating movement and nutrition and other stuff into psychology becomes really important. the siloed effect, what Sapolsky calls the danger of being in buckets and not integrating the buckets into human behavioral science, leaves us with both hands tied behind our backs and probably on a peg leg and a really bad artificial limb if we're going to practice with patients who are deconditioned, who don't sleep, where we look at anhedonism without looking at dopamine reward pathways, where we look at guilt and melancholy without looking at serotonergic pathways, where we look at psychomotor retardation without looking at norepinephrine, where we look at sleep problems and sleep architecture without looking at delta-inducing sleep peptides, and where we only look at learned helplessness. Thank you, Dr. Beck. We look at learned helplessness and go, okay, we'll just deal with the efficacy, which in itself is a motivational self-determination science. That's where there's good research in self-determination in orthopedics, in motivational interviewing in the boardroom, in the military. I wrote the first book on motivational interviewing in elite sportsmen, and Rolnick has popped out with a new one recently, which he said was the first, and I sent him a nasty email saying, Steve, I was first, it was me, it was not you, I was number one. He said, sorry, didn't know about it. Nobody read the bloody thing, but actually became a textbook for, personal trainers worldwide, motivating clients to healthy behavior. Ask, don't tell, be athlete-centered. So many lessons from Carl Rogers, so many lessons. If you ask people what was the most influential book they ever wrote, it wasn't Rolnick and Miller. It was Viktor Frankl, The Will to Meaning, around values and around the Holocaust. And I spent years working with Holocaust survivors and their memories. And, so who drives me up the wall with excitement? Robert Sapolsky, Elizabeth Loftus, certainly Carl Rogers, in just being client-centered, certainly Miller and Rolnick's research, and certainly obviously Hayes and all of the followers of Hayes in relational frames was one of the most important things I ever managed to almost understand. I'm still trying. I'm trying to teach it now, which might help my understanding, given we learn by showing and doing rather than, and I still can't get my head around it exactly, because I think relational frames is amazing. And even as a neuropsychologist, I find relational frames quite amazing. So the integration of the Liberated Mind book by Stephen Hayes, The Spark by John Ratey, a whole range of works by Gazzaniga. Gazzaniga's split brain studies, his evolution of the right hemisphere, left hemisphere, already defining why, kids with ADHD are neuroatypical. Their brains don't develop fully at the same level until they're 25. They lag 30% behind. So Russ Barkley, who, I collaborated with a few years ago in ADHD and sent him emails, and we landed up writing the same article completely separately and then published in the same month. And I wrote him and said, oh my God, you published on the evolution of executive functions and frontal lobes exactly as I did, difficulty in getting conceptual stuff published was our discussion at the time. So those are the kind of things I get excited by in publications and in terms of assimilated knowledge being put forward. Not in buckets, but integrated.
Yeah. Something that's certainly struck me, certainly from the likes of whether it's Steve Hayes or your Kelly Wilsons, that great simplicity around the, I suppose, the pillars, if you like, of mental
health. Elegance of those pillars.
Yeah, just things like sleep, eating real food, having really strong bonds, connections with others, reducing
socializing, just so incredibly powerful.
Yeah, purpose, meaning, fulfillment. Just a little bit of mindfulness practice, or even rest, relaxation. Removing
gut biome. What about gut biome and socializing, sitting around drinking kombucha and kefir and fulmayok?
Yeah.
Now you've got to help me with something. Nesh, you've got to help me with the socialization piece, because I get bored with people in dinners. I sit with people, I get bored because I don't want to talk about people's kids or, their motor car service or, what they do for a living. I like being around young people talking about their research and their science, and, I don't want to hear about somebody's trip to Vietnam. Wonderful, make me jealous. I couldn't care. So that socializing piece, obviously social withdrawal is so ubiquitous to depression, to schizotypal, schizophrenic, schizoid, schizoaffective, to autism. This socializing piece, two things for psychology I want your help. Number one, so few studies on evil. And second of all, so little on how people can truly get socially integrated when nobody likes them. Probably my problem, but still. How do we do
It's a
those?
hard one with clients, because my understanding is it's fairly difficult, and I've heard people like Jordan Peterson talk about socialization. If it's not developed to a certain level by age 4, it's very, very difficult for children to develop into young persons, into young adults and adults, to pick up some of those social cues. Now, I don't know research that he's referring about, but I know that a lot of things happen, as you say, biologically, that might put certain limits, and it's hard to kind of learn socializing.
Sure. And that's why it takes 25 years for the frontal lobes to develop. We're not born with a nice genetic socializing thing. We've got to learn all those subtle if-thens in our first 25 years before the bloody frontal lobes shut down. They were developed as the arm or the agent of civilization, of socializing. Luria called them the cortical knots that get tied across the zones of proximal development. I don't buy the Jordan Peterson 4 years. It's 25 years, but what kind of socializing do you get by the time your brain's, shut down is really important, because thou shalt not kill, but yes, you can kill if you wear a uniform and shoot the right people at the right time. And you shouldn't lie, but if grandma gives you a really crappy present, of course you can lie to her and tell her how wonderful it is while passing it along to be thrown out. Those subtleties, which is socialization, which Jordan Peterson talks about, those subtleties are incredibly difficult. They are so culturally bound. They are so values bound. There are so many rules. I mean, God forbid you go to a French dinner party and take your own wine, or take dessert, or, go and look at the table that's just been set before you're invited in. You never go back. I had a poor friend who moved to Paris and was a social disaster because, my God, there were rules. She was given a beautiful cocktail, but it seemed to be in 4 layers, so she mixed it up with a spoon and nearly got shot. The French were ready to guillotine her for destroying the various levels of my wonderful thing, She brought her own wine. I mean, destroyed all of the wine choices for the night. Just those subtle things could ruin you, but we know it's so important. I haven't seen good science on how one really is capable of doing that, what makes people likable and what makes them unlikable. What is the formula there? Share people's values, sense of relatedness. That's kind of where we're going. We like people who are like us. Oxytocin makes us all wonderful, makes fruit flies good listeners, whatever, as Sapolsky says. What does it do for us? It makes us incredibly sticky to attach to people who are like us. It makes us xenophobic and racist to people who are not. So there's a backside, downside to that. So for me, the two aspects of how do people get evil, how do they get racist, how do we train that, context psychology and all that, kumbaya, nice. How do we do this?
Maybe what we're trying to do is change biology in psychology holding a position. I mean, I know when a client comes in who is having social difficulties, my yearning, my desire of looking at another human being is to reduce some of their suffering. Maybe the position is to accept their suffering, and that part of their biology, if I look at the big bell curve, is they're less likable. And maybe that's not necessarily for anyone to judge and kind of just accept it on a big biological natural level, where maybe back in Sapolsky's research of looking at what it might look like thousands of years ago, they might be the ones that were picked off by the lion because they wouldn't be in the group. And now we don't have the
Yeah, I wrote about that in an article I published on, the evolution of the frontal lobes and why our toolkits are often empty, and the difficulty with assessing these abstract, symbolic kind of thinking ideas. But absolutely, if you didn't have four-wheel drive and keep up with the hunters and some leopard or lion picked you up. I mean, in the African savannah, your lifespan, unprotected and not knowing what you're doing in the bush, is 24 hours. You're going to get eaten or, bitten by something. In the Australian bush, I don't know, dingoes, yeah, I'm sure they're dangerous, but come here, doggy, try and talk to a full-grown lion. So what do we do? I think, let's look at things like, increasingly schools, they've always been, are they really good with kids who are not neurotypical? Every ADHD, ADD kid I find who's in trouble hates himself or hates herself, mostly the males obviously, but hates himself, regards himself as absolutely terrible because he's at a private school and can't do 4-unit math, or he's unable to contain himself past lunchtime, or he gets to school, he's already harassed and already miserable, and then teachers stand over him. We're not good with neuroatypical people. We are still rejecting oxytocin versus rejection. How do we do that? Contact theory hasn't worked. Israelis and Palestinians still attack each other, and, Northern Ireland, it's flaring up all over again. Just contacting with people. Years ago, what was it, 1972, my biology lecturer at university said the downfall of humankind will be the miscegenation of different language groups learning to hate each other. In other words, spilling over into each other's territory, the rise of nationalism, the rejection of diversity and inclusion. Are we getting better? I think in many ways we're getting better at that, where people who are atypical will still be liked and still be invited and join in.
Well, maybe it's also about the language that we use, the fact that we go out and categorize people based on, thresholds of what we say is functional or dysfunctional, whether it's, impedes or affects their social, academic or work life. Maybe we're making this up rather than, as you said before, describing. And I think it's kind of like when you get 10 psychologists or psychiatrists or GPs or whoever it might be, the learned people, and you ask them all to interview a client, they can all go out and describe that client. They'll basically say the exact same description of the person because the person, they're just basically repeating what the person said. But the moment we go to categorize, I think we get vast differences in diagnostics. Some person says it's anxiety, another person says it's adjustment disorder, another person says it's depression in the context of whatever it might be. Someone says personality disorder. We come up with different narratives, but the consistency is everyone still says this is the context. It doesn't matter where you come from. It could be a psychologist or, a psychiatrist, GP, could be the person's friend. They'll probably all describe the same context in which this person lives. So maybe a little bit of this is about language and describing differences and similarities and normalness, the bell curve, rather than saying one's right, one's wrong, good, bad.
Well, look at the fact even professionals, I get kids who are referred for all kinds of therapies. And when you look at their test results, they're not below the 2nd percentile. They're not above the 98th percentile. They're in the stock stand normal group. As my wife's grandfather said, if everybody's children are geniuses, where do all the idiots come from? We are such a diverse population, and those nosological categories with the DSM-4 and 5 and 40 are in all of those things. I mean, there was more variance within a category than there was, between categories. And, the Black Dog Institute and Gordon and everybody has said, listen, the reason why we can't get decent drugs is because the only people we include in our trials are the people who pass the DSM-5 criteria for depression. The other ones, so we only get 30% responses to an antidepressant. And by the time you've done 3 or 4 changes, you've got a 60, 70. Why does psychotherapy have an 84%, benefit? is because you can't take 1,000 people in the room and divide by 1,000 and get the one that you're treating. Everybody got to be depressed differently. It didn't matter, whatever, their intra-utero environment was different, and even twins are bathing each other. And, you know, what does a twin girl look like with her brother? She's being bathed in his testosterone. You know, is she going to be more aggressive? You know, all this rubbish. Everybody's such an individual, so we will always come back to the nosological categories are not much use, which I like ACT saying we're not really so keen on diagnosis. We're much more keen to just describe the pathway by which people come to be dysfunctional in the context they're in. What was the process? What is the process in relational frame terms and out? What is fusion? What does diffusion look like for this person? What are their particular values? And, you know, all all terribly useful.
Yeah, because I've got to ask a hard question, which is maybe on an evolutionary basis, and I don't even know how this would work, but maybe on an evolutionary basis, there is great value in antisocial behavior and in narcissism. You know, it might not be nice for you and I to meet that at times, but maybe there's great value. I mean, obviously, those traits have, you know, come to 2021. They've lasted, and they're going to last beyond. There has to be some value in that variability, you know, that we keep putting these traits out into the world and we see what happens. You know, we see how well do they go out and procreate, and you know, that is a function of evolution, right?
Well, I mean, you know, evolution has more than just kin selection and individual selecting and group selecting. You know, it's got all of these things. So how would the narcissist do in the group? How does, you know, I put people somewhere between failed narcissism and high functioning psychopathy. You know, I think everybody sits along there. And obviously, if you're the narcissist, you are going to breed. You know, you are going to breed. The big-headed male, you know, from 200,000 years ago, fathered 95% of the kids in the herd. The woman there would just grab his genes because there was a good chance that this rugabugger was going to pass on his genes, and we still reward. So why the narcissist? We reward aggression all the time, the right kind of aggression, being a sportsman, being a politician, being rich. These are things we reward, but they're all types of aggression, really. They're aggressively self, you know, aggrandizing and moving on and you know, being as narcissistic as hell. I don't think you get to be, you know, a great entrepreneur unless you've got that edge to you. Maybe ADD helps, maybe ADHD helps, maybe being OCD will help your ADD, but the narcissism is rewarded. You know, thinking highly of yourself. Again, maybe not in a group of people who have 5 villages sharing their watering around their rice. When you tell them to wear a mask, they wear a mask because they're used to collaborating village to village. When you get the lovely kid who was brought up by mountain people teaching him to be autonomous and grow wheat, he's going to be self-aggrandizing and say, I will not give up my mask freedom to save the guy next door. I will kill the enemy, then I will kill my cousins, then I will kill my half-brothers, then I'll kill my brother, you know, as opposed to I will give my life for my twin. I will give my life for 2 brothers. I will give my life for 4 half-brothers. I will give my life for 8 cousins. Yes, I think we reward aggression. We reward a lot of the traits of narcissism. These men and women pass on their genes. In the same way that the schizotypal personalities pass on enough genes so that schizophrenia carries on, even if people with schizophrenia don't breed that much. I think we reward aggression in people. We're going to keep getting narcissists and worse, failed narcissists, and maybe the high-functioning psychopath.
I mean, in some way, if I think about it, some of the great inventions of the world have been because people have backed themselves in such a strong way that they have believed within their own capacities, and maybe they haven't actually been the greatest themselves, but they were able to market themselves in that way. They were able to push their agenda in that way. They were able to get a movement, people to believe them. It's kind of like academia. If you think about academia, there's great research going out there, but some of it's just not publicized very well. Yet it might be far superior than, you know, what someone else might be able to do to you know, present it across the stage.
Sure. Well, contextually, a whole bunch of Dutch scientists produced literature on the size of the in the, you know, anterior cingulate, wherever it was, that the change in size could be much more common in gay guys. They're not, and they were pilloried, crucified, and whatever else. You're making gay into a disease, and somebody will try and cure it, and, you know, people took to the streets to kill these guys. And then a few years later, the same study that was replicated by somebody else who just happened to be gay, and everybody came out and said, look, amazing proof that it is biological. It is not a choice. Same research, different context, different people. So I agree with you. Some people get it right in being promoted in their research, being promoted in their literature. Wonderful. So does the narcissism. It only works well when it is rewarded by the society you're in. It is really not good to push an agenda in Australia, for instance, where humbleness is appreciated, unless you're royalty or you are sports people, who are our royalty anyway. You can get away with being a narcissistic prick as long as you have a crown on your head, a title behind your name, which we worship, or otherwise you're a sportsman, which we worship. But God help you, you walk into, you know, a group of people and you're not Aussie. If you don't play Australian rules, I see immigrants, especially Americans, especially South Africans, getting crucified for being narcissistic. But what does narcissism help? In a narcissistic environment, you don't get bullied because you don't realize it's bullying, and you don't care about being chewed out by the boss. The boss calls you in and he says, you're a bloody idiot, you're a fool, what did you do? You screwed up, you're going to cost us a fortune. I should beat you and run you out of town, you moron, you arsehole. You walk out the door and you go, what happened? Oh, the boss just chewed me out. Other cultures, oh my God, you know, I am a weak person. You can't say that to me. Oh my God, stress leave, EAP, quick. Serenity now, kumbaya, everybody help groom me quickly. I've been unjustly crucified. So I think the tolerance for all of these things, yes, you can be self-promoting this, that, and the other. Get it wrong, you get crucified. You get it right, and you become Prime Minister of Australia.
I think something that really impressed me, something that had a huge impression on me was listening to Steve Hayes do a keynote presentation and talking about a particular study around hens and
yes,
looking at you know, what was the yield of hens in cages in a battery hen farm. You're nodding and smiling. You obviously know. For our listeners, and please jump in, Roy, and tease out where I get this wrong. But the researchers identified cages that had the highest yield and put them, I suppose, effectively to one side. And then they looked at the yield of specific individual hens and they put them all into cages to have, for example, 10 high yield individuals in one cage versus a group of 10 who are considered as a group of high yield. And I think they to try and control for extraneous variables and like, I think they got them to have 3 generations of chicks before they did the research, and there was a slight improvement of the group cage with a little bit more yield versus the individuals that were all grouped together after they were in the cage for a short period of time. The yield went down dramatically, and that was because this kind of high achiever, probably high narcissism, they picked each other to death, and, you know, under stress, you don't go out and produce as many eggs. They rip each other's feathers out, and, you know, they're hyper vigilant and so on and so forth. And in some sense, it's kind of like, you know, what what the top of a lot of organizations look like, maybe in politics or something like that, or
power struggles. Just think the Milan School therapist wrote years ago about the secret games of organizations, talking about the power struggles that went on, and you got hired by the CEO, but the MD didn't like it, and the MD would sabotage you because they didn't like the fact the CEO brought in the experts, all this kind of thing. But certainly, yes, with the chicken studies and with rat studies and whatever else, it's not just kinship selection, it's all kinds of selection going on. There's group selection, other things. When you've got all these narcissists, there's only a limit to this individual competition and individual selection. Group selection in these animals is absolutely critical, isn't it? Because group selection means I have to sacrifice for the group, which means I can't just keep on producing eggs. Who's the best egg producer? Well, chicken is an egg's way of producing another egg. We want to focus on the eggs. And what we do is we put chickens that are related to each other, that recognize each other as kin, that will sacrifice their own breeding for the next one. Think about the ideas, well, if you are gay, are you sacrificing your reproductive rate or your reproductive capacity for your siblings? Will they have more kids and be more fertile? It turns out, not a strong effect size, but you've got people who can look after people. Why did the chicken cross the road? Not to get to the narcissistic rooster on the other side, but to do some kinship selection, to do some pseudo kinship. The same with the army. Why did the Americans stop integrating their forces? Is because if the guys all came from the same village, they would shoot the officer to get out of Vietnam. But when you got guys who were completely diverse, they did not trust each other. Nobody was shooting the officer because nobody had everybody else's back. This guy was leaving tomorrow. This guy arrived today. You didn't have your band of brothers because you were in the wrong war, the wrong values. And that's what happens with the chickens, really, isn't it? The pseudo kinship didn't happen if they're all competing, because alpha males will go for alpha males and alpha females will go for alpha females. You took a lot of testosterone and you made these animals aware that there was a loss of social status, so they attacked each other. Absolutely. All of the narcissists. Just think, there was one study in 1932, the shamans in this Native American tribe, there was one shaman, and he was very good, and he got the rain to come and he got people out of all kinds of difficulties. He was a great medicine man. And one of the researchers there was talking to them, an ethologist, and he said, "Your medicine man is really amazing." And he said, "And thank God we've only got one of them." Because when you've got two medicine men, you've got a war. One has to get out of the village. You don't want to put all your good egg layers there because they compete. And what happens is they suppress, the Wellesley effect. They suppress each other's hormones in competition and they stop producing eggs and they lose all their feathers from stress. The Wellesley phenomenon of we all synchronize our periods until a dominant male comes along. And who do we synchronize our periods to? To the socially dominant female in the group. All this stuff still makes a difference, doesn't it? So can we have more than one CEO in a company? No, thanks. One psychopath is enough. Can we have more than one professor, head of a department? I won't go there. But do we need that narcissism to get there?
Sorry, Roy, you're about to say.
Do we need that narcissism to get to those levels of leadership? Is it a requirement? Because are we rewarding the aggression that comes with that personality? The answer would be yes, we are. And testosterone makes people more sensitive to that kind of thing and therefore probably better at being more aggressive in response to that sensitivity and status. Testosterone enhances your sense of your status.
I'd have to just think that evolution has brought us here for a good reason. I might not be able to give you an explanation or a narrative, but it seems to me that if it's here, it makes sense. I mean, we could probably put a whole lot of narratives together as to why. But to me, those studies just seem really, really like they make sense, that there's a collective, there's leadership in those group ones that just organically have got together, which means There's someone who puts out high output. There's someone who's cranky and, kicks the door down and screams at everyone. There's someone who goes out and kind of calms everyone down and softens everything. Someone who goes out and does the social things and gets coffees for everybody. They're all fitting a piece. It's like our society. We all are very diverse.
That's group selection. And that's the group selection, isn't it?
And so as a society and as a species, we do quite well. It doesn't mean that there isn't infighting and so on, but some of the craziness that kind of baffles me is when we're trying to stop natural behavior. We rather than talking about kind of saying, look, we need to moderate, bullying or work with kids who are being really aggressive with other kids, or, we need to kind of try and shield others. But where we have this kind of like no bullying policy, I get that and I understand that, but I think there's a description, there's a way that we can educate the whole school and the parents and the kids in a different way, rather than these quick grabs that might not tell the whole story, because we need to kind of support those that both feel bullied and those that are bullying as well, because I imagine they must be hurting themselves quite a bit also.
Exactly. How do you understand aggression if you don't understand the anxiety that underlies the aggression? Because why, and when they do studies of bullies' families versus the victims' families, it's the same kind of upbringing. It's the same anxiety expressed differently. The bully will do what is socialized to do, not because it's more aggressive as a bully, but because it has got more anxiety and it is displacing the anxiety through aggression. If you take 5 rhesus monkeys, males, put them all in a room, there's a battle goes on, and then you can see that's the number 1 monkey, number 2, 3, 4, and 5 in rank. No problem. You take number 3 monkey, you fill it full of testosterone to the gills. It's on androids. It can bench press 100 kilos. And it goes into that room, and who does it beat up on? Numbers 4 and 5. You just enhance the aggression to the lower ranking males, because testosterone enhances your sense of social whatever. When the bully goes to school, they get exactly that feeling, and now there's some testosterone coming in. And don't forget, females, when they get anxious, the adrenal glands in pushing out all the adrenal stuff and the cortisol stuff, pushes out testosterone with it to prepare them for the fight and flight. For the fight and flight to be aggressive, guess what? You need testosterone and you need aggression, and that's how you displace your anxiety. Exactly what you said. Why we're not treating the anxiety in the bullies so they don't have to beat up on 4 and 5. They're rather happy with being number 3 and, God forbid, not being 1 and 2. The other issues in warrior culture, certainly, if you're a Maasai warrior, someone in Africa, the age of 13, you get given a spear and told, go out and come back with a dead lion, or don't come back. Rewarding aggression. And if you're going to be a warrior leader, you cannot sit there sobbing every time somebody gets killed. You need to be able to send hundreds of thousands of people on D-Day and not worry that you're going to lose 5,000 Americans on day 1. Not send people to Vietnam and lose 55,000 Americans in 10 years. You've got to not care. You've got to be a bit of a psychopath whose anterior cingulate doesn't turn on and tell the amygdala to light up and sob when your whole platoon just got wiped out. Look at the British officers in World War I and their status versus, let's say, someone like General Monash and the way he viewed the world as a Jewish officer, as a Jewish trained, Jewish brought up, 613 good deeds a day and so on. There is a different approach. If you think of the fact that 16% of everyone in the world today is descended directly from Genghis Khan, we know what a psychopath can do in terms of breeding. That was a man who piled up the corpses all over Europe, definitely didn't have some empathy, and his anterior cingulate didn't give a damn. But he fathered enough children. 16% of people in the world carry his genes. That's an effective character.
I don't even know where to go with that, because that's just mind-blowing. But maybe it's also that similarly, all the other genes, we all go into this big soup and this big pool, and as you say, we we also have learnt from, whether we talk about it from an epigenetics point of view, or our ancestors, or the values that have been passed along, that both the nature and the nurture, we still have to look at ourselves within a context, and whether something, I suppose, flourishes or remains dormant also depends on one's context.
Absolutely, because genes don't define any behavior. Genes sit there. The blueprint doesn't build a car. The context tells the genes where to turn on, where not to turn. So we can forget about genes linking to behavior. We need all these expressive elements and whatever. We need context, which is why I like all the contextual-based, process-based therapies. We're always looking at context, to the self in context, to how we are responding, because otherwise there wouldn't be an Auschwitz, a My Lai massacre, a diarrhea sin. There would not be these anomalies where otherwise decent human beings suspend their self-reflection, as Eichmann suggested, and become little monsters. What's the helicopter view for everyone is where therapy comes in and says, you are not the massacring American teenage people killing the Vietnamese. You're the guy in the helicopter coming down and threatening them. I will shoot the next American soldier who kills anyone. Why are you different? Context.
What's really interesting that kind of just jumped out at me, we often talk about wars because they're so memorable, and we kind of remember the things that are frightening and scary. And in so many ways, when I think about it, some of the most incredible marvels of the world is that we have a medical system across the entire globe that is in constant work of helping people, whether it's through accidents or disease or prevention, that there's more of a gene, there has to be more of a gene out there, which is really looking after, not gene, but at least the way that we structure society that looks after one another. That when we look at how many millions of people were killed, for example, in a single war, when you look at how many millions of people have been given extra years of life, or treated, or who are now in remission from whatever disease they had at the time, the numbers would have to be billions and billions and billions, and staggering over the last 300 years, whether it be from shaman, once upon a time, or whether it be from modern science these days. The rates of killings and wars must be minimal compared to even just one little thing like medicine, let alone psychology, or all the different industries and amazing sort of people and researchers. That's just mind-boggling, but it kind of keeps getting very sticky. We keep thinking about the wars, because I think the same way. I'm like, oh yeah, we kind of relate these things to these big events that are memorable, like the Holocaust. Everyone knows about it.
Well, think about it. Yes, we are getting much, much better at empathy. We get upset and we care about, a piece of furniture looking bad in the rain in an advert, and we anthropomorphize it to death, and we get empathic about some kid with a snotty nose in Africa and send them money to dig a well so they can have clean water. And I'm not worried about eating a feted animal tonight and getting anthrax. Yes, we've conquered a great deal. But if you think of medical science, it's done two amazing things. Number one, provided sewerage and provided clean water. That gives us our age expectancy at birth. Where we fall apart is our inability to think about the abstracts, us versus them. If you think about what constitutes a war, it is making sure that everybody's prepared to kill, to drop out the empathy, to really be nasty, provided you can make an us being the good guys and them being the bad guys, and dehumanizing them, which is the lessons of the Holocaust, of the Rwandan Holocaust, of making people into cockroaches. Hitler chose the Jews to be vermin, to be rats and cancer. Islam is a cancer against Christianity, and so on. All of these, rabble rousers have to get an us versus them going, and it doesn't always work so well. And when it doesn't work, for me and for Sapolsky and other lecturers along the way, these are the exciting things. In 1914, the British, suspending hostilities to bury their dead, land up playing football for 2-3 days with the Germans, swapping food, giving Christmas presents, and then agreeing to fire over each other's heads until the British officers eventually came and threatened to shoot anybody who wasn't killing Germans. They set up, and you can see in the letters of the British soldiers, we fired a shell over, we got our best gunner, fire a shell at that tree behind the Germans. He hit the tree 5 times. The German gunners went, the British aren't this bad. Maybe we'll hit their tree. And then they exchanged fire for days, killing nobody, until the officers arrived and said, kill Germans. You know, there's a lot of those things. You know, stopping Lieutenant Kelly from the My Lai massacre took 1 man in a helicopter, you know. So I think there is a lot of good, but nevertheless, with the Donald Trumps in the world who are intellectually dull, but intuitively can cause people to rise up against each other, to create an us versus them. Republicans are amazing. QAnon is brilliant. Lefty, you know, Antifa is just, you know, the us versus them is where we don't do a very good job. And
this is where I think sometimes social policy can do exceptional jobs in terms of, I know that stopping smoking in Australia has done an exceptional job in an us versus them, because it's kind of saying the ones that smoke, have to now leave the restaurant, they have to leave the facility. And not only that, they can't even be within X amount of meters from the front desk. It's kind of like, you know, kicking them out of the clan, out of the group, making it very expensive as well. But kind of publicising all the undesirables, and it's an us versus them. But it's been a great public policy, at least if we think about, you know, rates of lung cancer and the like.
Stroke and heart attack and all of those. But if you talk to the people who are banished outside,
yeah, that would be awful.
If you ask them how they feel, they say, I feel like I'm a cockroach. I feel like I am dirty and contaminated. And of course, that's on the receiving end, and it makes them angry. And so acts of defiance, I will keep smoking. Not too many, fortunately. But seatbelts is another good example.
But it's awful, yeah.
Scared. You couldn't get people scared to wear seatbelts, but when you showed them a disgusting face, a smashed up, put my face through the windscreen moment, a bullseye moment, that's when people started to go, ooh, I don't want to look like them. Us versus them got people to wear seatbelts. I don't want to look disgusting.
Well, I actually
did that with a good.
I actually thought the seatbelt one was when they started making that awful noise that was so irritating that people were unwilling to have that noise, that, you know, that immediate sort of emotional, visceral thing of, I've got to get rid of this feeling because it's so annoying, this bell, click it in.
Forced compliance, yeah.
Was the compliance factor, yeah.
But that's forced compliance, and you know, yes, it's very effective because the car won't go without it, and you don't have a choice. But that's going to irritate you every time if you're an autonomous, if you're a failed narcissist, you know. But yeah, absolutely effective. The car won't drive if you've got alcohol in your breath, you know, all of these things we can do today. And I do that with one of our companies in America that we started. Let me give you an idea of compliance. A colleague of mine, Amanda Johnston, and I were talking years and years and years ago, and she came up with an idea, and we got it going and we got it built. It's called BA Looper, and it is a mental health check-in app. And we had to work out how could we get people to check in every day with 5 trusted others on an app and let them know how you're feeling. And it turned out we could get them to swipe up or down and change the color of these lava lamp balls floating around. And we built this thing, which we thought was pretty good, using the user experience people to guide us, and lava lampy and everything else. Anyway, October 2017, we put it into the Apple Store and everywhere else. And 2 days later, Amanda phones me and says, we just went viral in 50 countries in 160 cities. Thousands of people are checking in with each other every single day. Well, Amanda, the next year was, well, first of all, we were nominated for the Global Mobile Awards in Barcelona when there still was such a thing before COVID. 150,000 people go to this meeting. Barcelona is packed, you know. Anyway, we came, I think, second to Microsoft's camera that talks for deaf people or something, blind people. Very nice. They spent 50 million. We didn't spend that much. Then 2019, Amanda is made Next Generation Leader by Time Magazine, under 30, Next Generation Leader. She's given that award for lupus. By then, 20,000 plus people have checked in, but checking in at the 3, 2, or 1 danger level of suicide, and keep on using the lupus so they didn't die. Hopefully that was working, and so on. All we did was take the habit of people being able to swipe, and suddenly we've got millions of people using a mental health check-in, because we're working on chain diffusion, role modeling, relatedness, heuristics, all kinds of stuff. Now we're doing a enterprise version to go to companies, where a company like Accenture with 400, 500,000 staff around the world, their human resources can check in and have everybody checking in the computer, puts all the blues here and allows you to get hold of EAP and allows you to get hold of all kinds of things and offer these people anonymously, do you want movie tickets? Do you want the day off? What do you want to do? You know, here's the EAP numbers, all kinds of things. All HIPAA compliant and all kinds of stuff going on. Terribly simple interventions to reach very big populations, but based on social behavioral, social observation, learning theory.
Yeah.
Just simple stuff. Neurology leads us to simple solutions, to simple understanding of why 73 million people, knowing what they do about old DJT, they still voted for him. Why? You go back dozens of years to disenfranchised, miserable, disgusted, upset people, and it all starts to look very reasonable that you would reward the psychopath for his intuition that maybe you want to hate somebody, maybe somebody has to pay, maybe evil has a payoff date.
Roy, how can people find out more about you, the work that you're currently on, or, you know, even reach out and work with you?
Clubhouse. Sure. So look, you know, I have my private practices, which are overloaded and whatever else, but they can just go to my website, roysugarman.com. It's not terribly explicit because I don't go into it much and don't self-promote. It's probably a failure of mine, but nevertheless, I'm a lousy psychopath. I'm not even a good failed narcissist, I think. So very difficult. But if you look up things like Transhuman Incorporated, if you look up Social Health Innovations, Transhuman Incorporated, I work with an amazing British group called BoxMedia. If you look at BoxMedia stuff, our logo looks very much like your patterns on the wall there. BoxMedia just revolutionizing online training for people. So have a look at BoxMedia, have a look at Transhuman. You just Google and you'll see what I'm doing in those companies and what we're doing. And the rest of the time, I'm just looking after people in Rosebank in Bankstown.
Fantastic. Sounds lovely. I'll have to duck in at some point next time I'm coming up a little bit north.
Absolutely. Otherwise, go on Clubhouse if you can get invited and come and chat. We have these wonderful chat rooms.
Absolutely. Roy, much appreciated for your time, your expertise. It was great talking and very insightful, and looking forward to hearing more from you in time to come.
Great. Thanks so much. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you. Time just flew by, didn't it?
It has. Almost an hour and a half thereabouts anyway. So,
yeah. And you almost got a word in edgeways, which is pretty good.
No, my job is not to be talking too much. So it worked out quite well. Thank you very much. And appreciate your time. And got to do it again at some point.
Great. Well, from a rotten listener to a good listener, thanks so much.
Thanks, Roy.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please support it by going to iTunes and putting a review, subscribe, share it via social media, and tell others about it. Start a conversation. It's listeners like you that make this able and possible, and why we bring in these guests to go out and share their knowledge and resources. And just lastly, if you are a psychologist and you want to go out and be part of a bigger team, develop your experience and get into some exciting work, come to strategicpsychology.com.au/careers and reach out. I'd love to hear from you.